Okay, let's get started, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to Terry's Defense. This is my chance to take just a few minutes to tell you how awesome Terry is. The word full stack roboticist gets bandied around a bit. I have to say that Terry is the real deal. So I remember, Terry came from Caltech. He had just absolutely glowing letters of recommendation talking about his capacity for algorithmic work. And I remember taking a video interview with him. And it was clear that he was in his apartment, but it also was pretty clear that he had like a full metal shop right behind him. I think there was a milling machine. I'm not sure exactly, but it was clear at the time that he was incredibly capable mechanically too. And over the years, I've seen this play out. He's built robots. He's done low-level device drivers. He's done high-level software. He's done theory. And I'd say more than a lot of people, he's really, I've watched him grow dramatically in his sort of appreciation for some of the more rigorous math and over the years. It's been really fun to watch. So, I mean, there's lots of projects he's done that you won't even get to hear about today. Some of them, I think all of them are embodied by the idea of sort of what's the fundamental problem we're trying to think about. And for instance, he did some work on control from pixels, which was really asking like a fundamental question about maybe pixel spaces doing something different, like lifting us into a high dimensional space, a bit like Koopman operators or something like this, and actually making the control problem easier, right? And this was just a really important big question to ask at the time when everybody started doing control from pixels and we didn't really understand what was going on. And that didn't even make the cut. Okay. You should know that Terry is our resident lab philosopher. Not in the sense of like spouting Hume and Kant, but just in the sense of like he's just thinks so deeply about why he's here, why he's doing what he's doing, whether we should be doing what we're doing. In our group meetings, we have a tradition of sometimes giving short talks. And Terry's given a number of short talks over the years that are, what does it mean to be a good grad student? How do you survive in research? And these are not like quick slides he put together because he didn't have research results to present. These are like super deep research, incredibly thoughtful, articulations of like what he's going through and what the lab is going through, what the world's going through. And he's just a fantastic person. Like it's just a joy to have him in the lab. The way he thinks about the whole lab, the dynamics of the lab, he watches out for people in the lab. He rescues plants. I think we've got like a 20-foot tall plant that I don't even know where he got that. And it's slowly been nursed back to health. He's just a phenomenal person to know and to have in the lab. And it's been an absolute joy. And I think you'll enjoy hearing his talk today. Terry.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Russ, for the awesome introduction. So the title of today's defense for me is going to be Leveraging Structure for Efficient and Dexterous Context-Rich Manipulation. And before we talk about context-rich manipulation, I first sort of overlay the structure for you. So we're first going to sort of introduce what this problem is, and then we're going to go through 3 of my contributions that make progress towards how I've been tackling the context-rich manipulation problem. So before we talk about context-rich manipulation, I think there's the problem of what manipulation really is, because people all have different versions and it ranges from pick and place to something really complicated. And I really like this definition from Matt Mason in 2018 that says manipulation refers to an agent's control of his environment through selected contact. And the reason why I like it is the sort of encompassing nature of it, the way that we're putting the feedback loop in the world. And we're really shaping the environment to our liking through selected contact. And if you think about what this encompasses, I feel like whether it's cooking robots or manufacturing, home robots, or construction, it's really this core capability that we need to imbue robots with in order to increase the spectrum of things we can automate in the world. So now that we're over with context-rich manipulation, in fact, for robotics people, it's not, I guess, we all know manipulation is important. So what really is context-rich manipulation? And I don't think there's a standard definition out there. It's being really a buzzword these days. And I think context-rich manipulation is, the way I define it, a kind of manipulation that strategically decides where to and makes decisions about contact after considering multiple possible ways of doing so, especially when such possibilities are many. And I want to go through a little bit about why this is difficult. So imagine that you want to push this red box to a goal position. And here, the decision you need to make is pretty simple. You only need to establish contact with the red box. and just push it this way. But when the systems get more complex, you can see that for robots, it becomes a significantly harder decision-making problem. So where do I make contact? Where should I avoid contact? What timing? And if I do make contact, what specific actions should I take? So in the problem of context-rich manipulation, as the possibilities become many, these strategic decisions really become harder. And I'd like to convince you today's robots are in fact not very good at this. So if we look at whole body manipulation, today's robots have sort of these fingertips where we're allowed to make contact with. And for the rest of the body, the hardware is not really built friendly for contact. And you can kind of see, at least in most software, we do collision-free motion planning for them. But this stands in stark contrast with humans where, I mean, everyone knows it's kind of written in the law, you have to carry all your grocery bags in one trip, right? And if you think about the maneuvers that we pull off while we do that, I think we kind of use our elbows or feet to open doors, turn doorknobs. I think there's a big gap there. The second example I have is dexterous manipulation, where just by looking at the hardware, you can see that this one Allegro hand, it's only really supposed to establish contact with the fingertips. And that's very unlike Julia Child here cracking an egg with two hands, where she's really leveraging the entire surface of her hand. So we'll be coming back to these two examples of whole body manipulation and dexterous manipulation throughout the thesis. But, just zooming out, I feel that if you're really capable, if you're capable in embodied intelligence, I think you should be able to maximize your potential of your physical embodiment. And that's just not what we're seeing right now. So I think even though I'm going down this relatively narrow problem of context-rich manipulation, I think it really represents a big problem of embodied intelligence for me. Okay, so let's go back to sort of one of the toy problems that I have and think about why this problem is so hard in terms of decision making. And I want to motivate the problem by this toy problem where we shoot a ball at some angle. That's going to be our decision variable. Then we're trying to hit this rotating pivot to maximize the transferred angular momentum. So for example, if we hit it here, I think we did a pretty good job. So we'll get a pretty high reward on our landscape. At this point, if we look at the local gradient information of what happens, it tells me that in order to increase the reward, I need to move my angle to the right side, which means I need to go up. But once I do that, I completely miss the pivot, landing in this low reward region. And then from here, I don't really have local information on how to improve, because any kind of perturbation I give is not going to be meaningful in terms of, where can I increase my reward? So I think this is a very short introduction to the two problems of contact that are quite fundamental, first being flatness, and the second being stiffness. And they really spell trouble for very classical sort of gradient-based local optimizers that we have right now. But nevertheless, I think this problem gives us intuition about how we should be thinking about contact problems. So here we see that given a contact event, so if I were to tell you whether we made contact or not, the rest of the landscape is smooth, conditioned on that. And classical methods have leveraged this insight beautifully, I think. So if you look at this result from 1982, from the Salisbury hand, and one of my favorite textbooks of all time, just next to Under Actuated. It's Murray Lee Sastri's Mathematical Introduction to Robotic Manipulation. I think they did this beautiful analysis over, what local approximation I can make over my kinematics, like, can I do what can I do with Jacobians? And I think this is, very satisfying, except it doesn't really tell us how to choose the contact modes to begin with. So we can go back and think about, okay, so why don't we kind of search jointly for the discrete modes, the contact modes, and the continuous variables. And I think this has led to some of the most kind of, I think, beautiful looking work in manipulation. So these approaches really do kind of a mixed integer combinatorial optimization style. They jointly search for the contact modes as well as what do you do within the contact mode. And, this is my friend Bernard and Xiao's work from the lab. And I think Francois' work from a while ago. I think these are, still, oh, Rachel, yeah. Still the sort of like I think they feel very satisfying because they have global capability. But the problem here is that as we increase the complexity of the system, the number of discrete modes that we have to consider increases as well. So before we saw that for the simple system, we only had the decision of making and breaking contact. But as our system becomes more complex, we not only have making and breaking contact, we have friction coming into play. So the base becomes 3. And for every potential collision geometry, we need to worry about which mode it's in. So it's quite a big number if you compute it. And for a system like the Allegro hand, I think we're really looking at an astronomical number that tells us this simply isn't going to scale. Think about combinatorial optimization routes. So in principle, and in practice, I think the methods that scale the best are the ones that relax this notion of contact. So this is Michael Posa's work from 2013 and Igor Mordach's work. They happened simultaneously. And you can see that I think they're showing very beautiful motion. It's really scaling to very contact-rich systems, unlike the ones we've seen before. But the catch here maybe is that these are fundamentally local optimizers, so you need to provide them with good initial guesses. And back then, even local convergence, I think, wasn't very robust. So a lot of people here might have experienced trying to, use this for their code, and it's not very robust. Okay, and in the final days, I think we have RL in the late 2010s, which really blew up as the state-of-art method in contact-rich manipulation. And I think these are obviously sort of the most performant methods that we've seen so far. We were all surprised that this actually worked. But if you look at OpenAI's graph of how much time it took to actually compute these policies, it took about 100 years of experience, and I think that's quite unlike a human being. So it's clear the strategy isn't going to scale. And I think that, so far I talked about 4 approaches: classical mechanics, combinatorial optimization, the relaxation plus nonlinear programming approaches, and finally RL. And in these 4 approaches, I think there's really 3 criteria that we look out for. First one being, does it scale with respect to contact? Does it have global scope? And finally, is it efficient? And we can see that none of the methods are really satisfying all of the 3 boxes. And so in today's talk, Thesis Defense, I'd like to walk you towards how we really made progress towards checking all 3 boxes: the context scalability, global scope, and efficiency. And so this is an NVIDIA demo not too long ago. I think it was a 2024 paper, which took 60 hours on 8 NVIDIA A100 GPUs. And we managed to do the same with only 5 minutes of offline compute on 1 MacBook M3 CPU. So I'd like to walk you towards the journey of how we got there. Oh, okay. So first, let's go over to the first part of my talk, which is going to be contact mode abstraction via smoothing. And here I really care about 2 questions. First of all, what allows abstraction of contact modes? And second, how can we achieve this more efficiently? And if we really, take a look at the previous approaches, the only approaches that scale with contact, I believe, are the ones that sort of did some kind of relaxation. But back when I was doing my PhD and was learning about all of RL, I think one of my fundamental questions was as follows. I think RL comes from a stochastic MDP framework, which has discrete states, and somehow when it came over to deep RL, it started becoming useful for deterministic and continuous systems. And this is sort of strange. Why would a framework that was modeled modeled for a completely different system work pretty good for our case? And I think throughout the 2 contributions in RL and ICML, I really showed that this is because RL considers a stochastic objective in policy. So let's go back to our toy example and say that this time we've completely missed the pivot. That's our initial guess. And we saw that for local optimizers like gradient descent, we're not really able to make progress here. But let's say in RL, we're not really sure about the effect of our decisions. So we're really going to push out an entire distribution of possible results. And we see that when we do some kind of a least squares fit, we get some useful information here now. And in fact, when we average all the samples together, it turns out to lie on this line. And now if we follow the direction of the gradient, we can stabilize ourselves back to a region where we have relatively high reward. So if we do this coordinate-wise, I think we have this kind of smoothed landscape, which is now very amenable for sort of gradient descent methods. And you can see it's kind of finding this balance between safety and optimality. So I think that noise really has the capacity to regularize typical landscapes, and it's alleviating the 2 problems that we saw on flatness and stiffness. And in fact, I think the non-smooth optimization community knew this a long time ago from 2010s. So this is John Ducci's slides on randomized smoothing. And my contribution was really connecting this work on randomized smoothing back to and using that to interpret why RL is doing well. So if we go to sort of more complicated systems, we'll see that the landscape might look like this. So we might have many pieces, depending on which the contact mode gets established first. So for example, this piece here might correspond to thumb only, this piece might be ring only, and this piece might be all combination of all 3 fingers. And we might have many of these in contact-rich manipulation, but by not really enumerating them, but rather sampling and reasoning about some average action, I think RL is really doing something, achieving a stochastic abstraction of what it's like to do contact-rich manipulation. And for me, I think the analogy I'd like to make is this picture of deep learning, where we're optimizing through a ReLU network. And in ReLUs, depending on how you transcribe the problem, you do have many modes, right? Some ReLUs might be active, some ReLUs might be not, but when we do stochastic gradient descent, we don't really enumerate all the possibilities. We just kind of sample them and think about the average result. So throughout these 3 papers and simultaneous work from Justin, I think we really try to connect the insights from randomized smoothing back to thinking about why does it work well in deep RL. So now that we know what allows abstraction, how can we achieve it more efficiently? But first of all, what do we really mean by efficiently? And I think RL really relies on this Monte Carlo estimation of gradients in 0th order. And we'd like to do better first by leveraging the fact that we have gradients. And second, we don't really want to do Monte Carlo because, well, it requires GPUs. And in order to do that, I need to first sort of dive a little bit into how modern day simulators work. So let's go and think about this question of, you're looking at a top-down view of a box, and this red circle represents your finger. And as this finger moves forward, I'm going to ask you to predict inside your head where you think the box is going to end up. If people have a reasonable guess, I actually went around the lab 3 years ago, and yeah, this person predicted a little weird straight motion, but I think most people kind of had a reasonable guess. It's surprising how much we differ in our guesses, but maybe what's important is we all know what's not going to happen, which is the box is not going to penetrate with the finger, right? And I think that speaks to the nature of how constraints are very important in simulating these context systems. And furthermore, I think because I told you it was a top-down view, we didn't really have to think about the notion of velocities. We only had to think about configuration space only. So there's a rich amount of work in both, constraint-driven optimization-based simulation. So Mujoko is a popular one that we're using, and I think Drake's adopted the SAP solver, which is very inspired by Mujoko over time. Colleague Simon has Dojo here. And then there's quasi-static modeling. It's also a popular approach to manipulation that's been pioneered from a long time ago. And this really, quasi-static means we're going to work at a very friction-dominated regime, and velocities are kind of ignorable. And then I met Peng, I think, who's really worked hard to mathematically formalize these things. So Peng was thinking about the simulation method called a convex quasi-dynamic differentiable contact model, CQDC. And here we're going to ignore the velocities of the system and say the state only comprises of configurations. Particularly, we're going to divide them into robot configurations and object configurations. And the input that we send to the system is going to be position commands to a stiffness controller, which is pretty much what you see in today's hardware. So how does this actually work? Just to give an extremely toy version of how this works, let's say my box used to be here, and then I want to simulate where it ends up. So here, this equation says, among all the possible configurations of the box that could be non-penetrating, I'm going to choose the minimum displacement one from the current configuration, weighted by some mass matrix inertia of the box. And in fact, the two equations are much more complicated, so I didn't show them here, but this can be casted into a standard second-order cone program, which we can use off-the-shelf solvers like Mosaic or Clarabelle. And we can use sensitivity analysis, which is a very classic technique from convex optimization, to back out what the gradient would be, gradient of the optimal solution would be with respect to parameters. And this is how we get the sort of differentiable simulation going. And you can see over time, we kind of advanced our simulator a lot. So here is, the Allegro manipulating a big small duck, and then here is the Iwa manipulating a giant duck. So there's kind of a scale difference. But the reason why I like this method so much is it really allows us to separate the complexity of, being context rich with that of being highly dynamic, like the ones we would see in pendulum, quad rotors, cardboards. So how do we actually abstract context for these optimization-based simulators? Because it's not very straightforward, I think. But well, one method we know, we already talked about the method of randomized smoothing, where we sample a bunch of samples and average them together. So in fact, if my nominal configuration is to send a command that has the ball stay exactly where it is, I can inject some noise into the decision variable, which is going to be input here, and average them to reason about some sort of what's going to be the average action that upon one-step dynamics. So I can do it in a randomized way, but this uses Monte Carlo and uses no gradient information. So to do better, we have to go back to sort of optimization literature. So we recall that this was the problem that we used to simulate our context dynamics. And this is really, we have a quadratic function and we have a bounded domain. And in convex optimization, we can do a thought experiment where we decompose this into the original quadratic function and what's called an indicator function, which is 0 when it's feasible and infinity when it's not. So the only way to achieve finite cost is if you're within the feasible set. And instead of having this stiff cliff, we can actually relax the notion of this indicator function using a log barrier relaxation. And if we add them together, we'll end up with this relaxed landscape. And what's important here is that the barrier function actually allows us to have see the effects of the constraints before we ever activate them from a distance. So in a similar way to randomized smoothing, we can actually control how much we smooth out the dynamics, but the effect will be the same. The forces will have, we will create force from a distance, and we can wonder actually, are these actually the same thing? The randomized smoothing story of averaging a bunch of samples together, and the barrier smoothing story of creating the same, creating some force from a distance. And in fact, my contribution shows that they are essentially the same, which means that there is this weird distribution here, which I could sample from and take an average in order to create the log barrier effect. But I think the key point is maybe that for barrier smoothing, we didn't require Monte Carlo, and we can take gradients of it through sensitivity analysis, which means we can do a much more efficient kind of copy of randomized smoothing without any parallelization. So here, I think we really took, inspiration from the LCP relaxation work from ICUT and Mike Posa. And over time, I think simultaneously, my colleague Simon Taylor, as well as Pang and my work, I think we connected this method back to interior point smoothing. And then there was some simultaneous work going on with Justin's group, randomized smoothing. And then in our Tiro paper, we kind of showed that they're actually equivalent things. Barrier smoothing is just more efficient. Okay, so far, I think we answered both of these questions. And we saw that we now have a method to abstract context modes for which we can take gradients efficiently, and we don't have to do Monte Carlo strategies. So let's try to, now let's go towards how to use it well and look at how do we use this for planning in context manipulation. And the first question I want to ask is, what is a good local model of context dynamics? So recall for CKDC dynamics, we have the state of the system, and the input is going to be the position command. And if we have the state and the input is going to be mapped towards the next state, right? So for example, if I command the input to be, exactly where it is right now, there's going to be no changes in the next state under my original dynamics. And I could take a submap of that dynamics on just how it affects the object and use a superscript O. And reason about, so if I inject perturbations into my nominal input, how is it going to change my change in the object configuration? And here we really care about an inverse problem that says, okay, now I'm going to give you a goal in the object space and ask you to find what is the optimal perturbation that I need to command in order to reach that goal. In the language of optimization, this problem looks like this, where we're trying to minimize some convex cost, which is a combination of getting to the goal and minimizing effort. But now I have this dynamics equation, which is nonlinear. So in fact, this problem is not convex, and I don't really know. We don't really have a good grasp on how to solve it. But let's take a sampling-based view of things. So if I were to somehow maybe sample some delta U perturbations around in this epsilon ball and map it through the dynamics and throw out samples of how it affected the object configuration, then I could plot the following pictures on how the samples are going to be. And this is maybe natural. So here in this configuration is telling you that the response looks like an ellipsoid. It's kind of like an isotropic. But here we see that because we can't, there's no way for us to move left, right? Because locally, I mean, this arm is never going to reach this arm, and contact is unilateral. And maybe here we can maybe summarize the problem more abstractly as we have a convex cost. And we care about characterizing this set of configurations where the object might end up. And the question is, how do we actually represent this set in a computationally tractable manner? For those of you who are maybe more in robotics, this is called the reachable set, right? And so how do we represent the reachable set in a more computationally tractable manner? And I think, so before we use the sampling-based method, the red plots that I showed, but we want to, again, use gradients, and we want to do it without Monte Carlo. So let's look at the first candidate, which is going to be based on Taylor approximation. So this is saying I can replace my original dynamics with this Taylor approximation, first order Taylor approximation. And then because I expect the accuracy of the approximation to degrade as I become further away from my nominal point, I'm going to put this bound around the distance, which is going to be, in optimization, is classically called a trust region. But this is now a convex optimization problem. I can again hand it to off-the-shelf solvers. And in fact, what does this reachable set look like here? Because this is a linear map and I have a norm ball here, I would expect it to look like an ellipsoid, right? And for this sort of case, I think this is a good representation of what actually happens. Whether or not I take true samples or take samples of the linear map and actually build the ellipsoid, they're the same. So we can kind of say we have a good trust region in this setting. And I think this is what we've been using for a very long time in existing works, whether it's sort of QP control, ILQR, DDP kind of works, or MPC controllers. We all leverage this local Taylor model of our dynamics. But there's a little problem here, which is, so this is what I'm showing you is, this is the nominal configuration. And as I command the robot to the left, my object is not going to move because I didn't establish context. So I'm going to see a flat response in the object. But if I do command to the right, I'm going to see a linear response. But let's think about what the Taylor approximation does. So I don't know if it's visible, but there's a slight gap. I didn't make contact yet. So if I take Taylor approximation, I'm going to have a very flat landscape. And this tells me I actually have no sensitivity of the object's position with respect to the robot command. And this is sort of unsatisfying in a way that the local model is too myopic. And in fact, a lot of the methods in the past really only reason about a fixed contact mode sequence where this information does become useful. So, but we already talked about a solution to this, right? We said we could smooth out the dynamics to be more useful. So the candidate 2 is going to be, what if we do it on smoothed dynamics? And you can see that on smoothed dynamics, it actually moves the object before contact is established at all, right? So what we talked about in the last section. But if we build a linear model, I think this is now good because before we make contact, we have sensitivity that says if I move the robot, the object is going to move too. So under this linear model, if I want to send the object to the right position, I better send the robot to the right as well. So that's kind of different from the exact Taylor approximation. So we saw that essentially the local model here using the first order Taylor approximation is too myopic. In this configuration, even though I'm barely in contact, my gradient is going to be 0. But if I use the smoothed model, now I have some Elliott-Solar representation again, and I can do better. And I think both Simon Taylor and Peng and me and a bunch of people at BDI like Yuki, we really talked about, so can we actually utilize this relaxed dynamics and do some standard methods like ILQR or even just LQR to try to stabilize and plan. But it turns out, I showed you this picture some time ago where we don't really achieve this ellipsoidal notion of a reachable set because, well, there's just no way to push this ball to the left locally, right? But even if I use the smoothed model, because it's fundamentally a linear map, I still have an ellipsoid. So here it tells me really there's a gap somehow where I can't really trust every point in my trust region. So what will be the reason? What are we missing here? And I think for the third attempt, I'm going to use friction cone constraints with this concept of dual linearization to expose what we're missing. I think one thing fundamental is going back to this figure. Here, if you wanted to push the object towards the right, the sensitivity gives me a helpful kind of bias. But if I want to actually, but let's see what happens when I kind of move to the left. It actually drags the object along with me, kind of like in a pulling motion. And that's not really allowed. That's sort of, it violates the fundamental nature of contact called friction cones. And, it's really a combination of if you're a finger and you're trying to exert some force on a wall, there's no way for you to actually pull on the wall, right? And second, if you wanted to apply any kind of friction, tangential force, then you can't do it without pressing hard enough, which is Coulomb's law, right? And they combine into this concept of a friction cone. But I think if we go back to our original equation, there's no way to impose this constraint given like x plus equals fxu, right? So I think what we really need is how do we really expose the expression for contact impulses to put in this equation? So one way to do that is recall that we had this equation that we're using to simulate the dynamics. But if we reason about the stationarity condition of this optimization problem, it looks like this, where it's sort of saying that the object movement weighted by the mass matrix is equal to the contact Jacobian times the contact impulse. And here, I think when we move from here to here, one thing that's kind of easy to miss for the non-optimization experts here is that this is really the Lagrange multiplier of the constrained optimization problem that tells me if I didn't reach the minima of the original unconstrained problem, there must be some forces at play that stop me from doing so, right? So in convex optimization, the dual variables become the contact impulses. So here in the second order cone program, most solvers not only give me the primal solution, but also the dual solution as well. And using similar techniques from sensitivity analysis, I can also query for the gradient of the dual variables as well with respect to the parameters. And that means we can now build a linear model over how my contact impulses are going to behave given this trust region. And again, it's going to be an ellipsoid because, convex set, linear model, convex set. But I now have the power to say, okay, so for points that predict a contact impulse that don't lie within the friction cone, they're not really trustworthy. They don't seem like they agree with my fundamental intuition of how contact works. So I can just take these constraints and sort of further qualify my original norm ball and build something called a feasible trust region. Oh, sorry, people ask me to say, I'm going to call this the feasible trust region. And if I pass it through the dynamics map, I'm going to call this the motion set, which is the allowable set of motions that I can make at the current configuration. And if I pass through the contact impulse map, I'm going to call that the contact impulse set. So now we see that the motion set actually has a very close agreement with the actual rollouts, so sampling-based approximation of the reachable set. If we're at an ellipsoidal regime, we don't need to worry about these friction cone constraints as much, so we still have this ellipsoidal approximation. And for those of you who are familiar with the old manipulation literature, there's something called a wrench set, so we might be wondering how are they related. And I think this one, because it also takes into account jointly the configuration of the manipulators, we can actually model things like manipulator singularities as well, which is a capability that didn't really exist in the wrench set world. Okay, so I think people knew about this already. The fact that you need to impose the lambda friction cone has to be in the friction cone. So if we look at all these works previously, I think we're more used to writing down the equations of motions by our hands and the constraints, and the dual variables are exposed. But if we're just given a differentiable simulator like this, and we're trying to do something with Taylor approximation, I think this work is trying to really tell you there's something fundamentally missing when we only talk about the configuration changes. We really have to go down to the force level and expose that in order to be consistent with the way we've been doing it in previous MPC literature. And we do that by studying convex optimization more carefully. Okay, so now that we went through the first section, how do we actually enable and use this motion set to do gradient-based planning? So in fact, now that we have a good convex representation of the allowable set of motions that we're allowed to do, we can simply encode this in a convex program that says get to the goal, minimize effort while staying in the motion set. And with a little bit more work, you can extend this into multiple horizons and kind of chain these motion sets together in order to build a sort of trajectory optimization framework. And how that's going to work is as follows. We're going to first roll out an input trajectory guess to obtain some initial trajectory. And then we can build this motion set or a feasible truss region around each point to obtain a local sort of dynamics model. And we'll use that to solve a convex program and update what is my optimal perturbation that I need to apply to my existing guess. And if I do that, I'll have a new input guess, right? And starting from here, I can iterate again until convergence is met. And if we can do trajectory optimization, we can do MPC. So MPC is this framework where we plan this trajectory, we roll out the first step, we execute the first action, but inevitably there's going to be a gap between the planned trajectory and where it's going to end up. So I'm just going to replan from where I end up and use this in a feedback loop in order to do control. So here I'm showing you the results of the MPC rollouts. I first want to tell you it's really fast. All we have to do is solve a bunch of SOCPs. But compared to how fast it was, I'm plotting x-axis is time, y-axis is for every collision pair, what is the contact impulse that I saw. And you can see that without the need to prescribe contact modes in advance, we're really having the ability to explore across different contact modes. And again, it really, in a fast manner, scales to the scale of Dexterous hands. So the controller can successfully scale. Oh, okay, yeah. So absolutely fast. And Peng and I spent a long time trying to do hardware experiments for this. So this is an UI by manual setup where this is the goal image, and we're trying to say, without any intermediate guesses, without any initial guesses, could we actually have the EWA move towards this configuration? Think a little bit faster, yeah. So we're playing, I think we did about 50 hardware experiments. And this is for the Allegro hand, where now we really have the ability to do sort of local adjustments. Oh, no, okay. Where were we? Okay, yeah. And throughout 50 runs on hardware and 1,000 runs on actual simulation Drake, we achieve about just 1 or 2 degrees of error in the UI bimanual setup. And I think about 1 to 2 centimeters of error. And our bucket is about 28 centimeters long. So that's doing pretty good. For the Allegro hand, it turns out to be a larger sim to real gap because sometimes there's slip happening, and I still don't know how to handle that. So we're just seeing a little bit of a bigger error, 15 degrees, but I would say for a local controller, this is the best among what I was able to build so far. So let's go back and ask, was the friction cone constraint really necessary when we put things in closed loop and see the rollouts? And we see that as we increase the step size that we want to take, having the friction cone constraints actually becomes better within finite iterations because we can take more steps in total. But if we don't impose this friction cone constraint, then it actually becomes worse because there's more samples as my ellipse weight becomes bigger that violate this fundamental nature of contact. Okay, so now we talked about local planning, and I think we have a method that's very context scalable and efficient. But we don't have global scope yet. And that's because I think we're missing something. I think there are fundamental limitations to these local controllers, which I'm going to go over and talk about in the next section. So leveraging this capability of local planning, how do we use that to actually do global plans? So here the questions I'm interested are, what are fundamental limitations of local control? How can we tackle difficult exploration problems? And how do we enable global planning capabilities? So far, this is going to be my most controversial take so far, but I think smoothing lets us really get rid of, discreteness coming from very granular context modes. So I think what we've kind of done is abstract context-rich manipulation down to the problem of motion planning over smooth systems. And I think that's kind of offending to people who study manipulation, but I kind of think that's, a good reduction. But motion planning over smooth systems is not necessarily easy. And I think the fundamental difficulties that we see in context-rich manipulation have a lot in parallel with motion planning over smooth systems. So here, all of you are familiar with this example where if I want to go from the red point to the blue point, I can't just go straight. I need to take all the way around and actually suffer increase in my Euclidean distance before I can actually go back down again, just like that. And this really reminds me of this problem where if I'm in a planar pushing setting and I want to push the box upwards, how do I actually push the box upwards if if my finger is right here? For here, I also need to go all the way around to the other side of the box in order to push and I think this is the problem of exploration, and it's one of the most fundamental problems that we have in manipulation. And maybe let me motivate this another problem from an optimal control point of view. Let's say my goal is I have this gripper that can kind of open fingers and move up and down. And I want to I want to put the yellow box in this goal box. So the question is, how do I do that? And, I think we know a simple solution. We go through the sequence of motions where we open the fingers, go down, pick it up, and come back again, right? But if you carefully think about it from like a local optimization or MPC point of view, like what reason do we have to open our fingers? Because I think initially, if we open our fingers, it has no effect on the reward that we set on the box at all. And I think the key is really we open our fingers because we've kind of seen this configuration already. We've seen that it's very easy to do local control from here. So we kind of do this dynamic programming thing where we say, okay, first I'm going to get to a point where it's easy for me to do local control, and then I can carry out the local control to achieve the task. So in order to find these states, let me reframe the problem from a local search for open loop actions to a more global search for initial configurations that asks, where should I actually place my robot to begin with? And if we look at sort of robot placement problems, I think there's mainly really beautiful works from the past on grasp synthesis that tell you how should I place my robot if I want to achieve a grasp. And then there's grasp-oriented grasp synthesis. So this is Bibbitt's work, which I was really inspired by, and then Kwan's work, which is a more learning-based framework. But you can see that grasp synthesis doesn't really tell us how to be goal conditioned. So I want something like this. So let's say I have my initial object configuration as the blue, and I want to reach the goal in my green. And if I'm in this following configuration for my robot, I want this to incur a high cost because there's no local action I can take to make the blue T pusher go towards the screen goal. But here, maybe I want a lower cost because now I think I have a chance. And I think we've already kind of quantified how to do this because we have a local controller and the MPC already. So we can query for the cost of this MPC problem online and kind of think about and evaluate how easy it is at this certain robot configuration to succeed in my task if I run the MPC in closed loop. And again, I think having a really efficient and context scalable MPC was, a fundamental thing that enables this capacity. So this is the problem that I want to solve now. So I want to search for the best initial robot configuration for MPC to start from, subject to the fact that I can penetrate. And if you plot the landscape of what this looks like, so here is the black is the initial configuration of the T pusher, green is the goal. And for each pixel, I'm plotting if I had put my robot there, what is the cost that I incur? So yeah, I think blue is low cost and yellow is high cost, and the red is the globally optimal sort of configuration. And one thing to note here is that this problem is very multimodal. It has a very complex landscape that, I think we really need exploration for. So we're going to resort to very sampling-based strategies. But yet, I'm going to persuade you this is not enough to still fully regularize our problem. So if I could show you these two configurations, I think they do equally well in terms of achieving MPC cost. But what's the better one? I think it's a pretty interesting problem that I have. And I think this is a better one because it's kind of more robust. So to formalize this notion, we already talked about the motion set, which is the set of all feasible motions that I can achieve at a single configuration. And if I command the goal there, for example, I can sort of record how far can I go along the motion set before I exit it. And I can do that for all directions. And if I sort of do that continuously for all directions and think about the minimum among those, I have this maximum inscribed sphere within the motion set. And for those of you who are more familiar with old manipulation literature, this is kind of like dual to the Ferrari-Kenny metric. But now we can see with this metric, this configuration that we have a full grasp is much better in terms of max inscribed sphere than the configuration that's one-sided. So by weighting these two costs, I think we're really achieving a continuous interpolation of what it's like to do grasp synthesis, and then what it's like to do here, some kind of good, just a total optimization view on where should I start MPC from. But still, the problem is still hard to solve with in this full coordinate space. So I use these fingertip space in order to first find the optimal configuration. And then I will do diff-ik to find the corresponding pose, configuration of the hand, sorry, and then verify that with MPC rollouts. So now we have the capacity to say, I not only have the capacity to sort of figure out the motion, but I can actually tell you what is a strategic place to start from if I want to achieve a certain goal in the space of objects. So here is a grasp that is good for achieving a pitch 90-degree motion. Here is a good grasp for a yaw 45-degree motion. And here is a good grasp for the opposite pitch direction. And turns out roll is like almost impossible for the Allegro hand. Okay, so now that we have this capability, how do we actually enable global planning capabilities? So we saw in the past that there's a rich history of like sampling-based motion planners, including PRM and RRT, which have been highly effective until they got outperformed by GCS. But I think borrowing from this capability, a lot of people and my colleagues combined, I think we've thought about how to really take these global exploration capabilities of sampling-based motion planning and apply it over to manipulation. But because these works were mostly still worried about contact modes, I think in most cases, you're either playing around with low dimensional systems or you're artificially limiting your embodiment to where you can make contact. So for example, a lot of them are only using the fingertips. And leveraging our MPC capability, I think we can do better. So here's a schematic description of what we are doing right now. So let's say we have this plane, a sort of subdimension in full configuration space that corresponds to the object. And if I give you the initial configuration of the object and the goal configuration, this grasp synthesis problem tells me, okay, I can sort of lift this initial configuration on the object space to a full configuration where it's beneficial for me to do MPC from, right? So if I project the final coordinate and my MPC has indeed succeeded, I will land on the goal in the object space. And so this is essentially what we've done. And we can chain those two together. I'm sorry, we can do one more run starting from Q10, which is this middle point here. So the question is, now I have these two MPC trajectories. How do I chain them together? And you can tell that they live in a vertical slice in this graph, which means while I chain them together, I can kind of assume that the object is going to stay still. And because of the rest of the robot is fully actuated, I can actually just connect them with collision-free motion planning. And with this, we call like a regrasping action. And here's what it looks like in practice. So here is the first MPC segment, which is starting from my found grasp. It's kind of struggling, it's going to push it. Then now, in order to go to my next segment, I can do collision-free motion planning and chain it to get to my next goal. So offline, we can actually build a roadmap of a lot of these and sort of keep it in a offline memory. And we'll be remembering all those plans as well. So here's the video that you saw when you just came in, sped up 10 times. And we managed to do this. So this is going to be a walk on the discrete graph that you just saw. This is going towards random configurations. And I think we were able to achieve this to about 150 before hardware failure. Okay, so finally, this is kind of unsatisfying, right? Because we're only doing discrete things. So once we get a new goal that's not in our graph already, how do we actually connect back? So I think we can search for the nearest configuration in a graph, just like PRM, and try to connect it towards that goal using MPC. And this is what we're going to see. Okay, I'll just play this simple. I think I'm doing okay on time. Okay, probably stop there. So now we've kind of walked through my three contributions. So first, how do we understand RL and abstract contact modes? Second, how do we leverage the fact that we abstracted contact modes to enable local planning for contact bridge manipulation? And finally, how do we leverage the local planning capacities to do global planning? And I think, so that's like roughly the story of how I achieved this capacity of really bringing efficiency by understanding more structure. And I think we really got down on compute compared to RL, as noted by the 5-minute sort of computation time on this exact laptop. Okay, I think it's time for acknowledgments. So I need my cards for this because, yeah, can't make a mistake. So first, I think I really like to thank Russ. The German philosopher Nietzsche came up with this concept called the Übermensch. Uh, and it roughly translates to Superman. And I think he thought about this concept of eternal recurrence. And what that is imagine if you die and you're supposed to live your life just the way it was. It will just play back forever. And then you die again, plays back forever. And I think people were saying, that sounds very haunting. It's very scary. And an Übermensch there are people that thrive at this notion because, they're really kind of living their life to the fullest. And I think like Russ comes pretty close in my opinion, at least in terms of work. And it's just been really inspiring to work with someone who I think believes in something really strongly and also puts out the time and effort to really, follow through his beliefs. And, I really want to thank him for all his, teaching and advising and patience throughout the PhD process. So thank you, Russ. Okay, next is Tomas. Tomas, I wish I had talked sooner to Tomas. He's really fun to talk to. And I think he is extremely thoughtful. And I think I really appreciate within a short span of time, the advice that he was able to give me, not in terms of just academics, but, in life as well. And as a fellow student of, history and philosophy, I always enjoy talking to Tomas. I always go into his office and say, hey, set the Puma arm, and then he corrects me. Last time I talked about the meaning of doing in academia and engineering. And he was like, are you familiar with the history of World War II? So I love that conversation. Then there's Justin, who's also in my committee meeting. Justin is in Zoom, but Justin is here. So I think Justin, I first met him during my work on randomized smoothing because it turned out that, two of us had been working on the same thing in parallel. Well, we kind of published first. And I think it's been extremely thoughtful that he didn't really think of it as a competition at all. I think he reached out for me to collaborate and, really had a lot of fun talking to his student Wilson. I think it really speaks to the great character that he has. And I'm really also thankful for the helpful advice that he was able to give me. So thank you, Justin. I can't, don't know I can see your face, but yeah, okay. Mark, I knew Mark through Danny Dries, who's actually coming to give a talk in this very room, 3 p.m. today. But although, it was a very short time talking to Mark, but I was extremely it was extremely impressive to see that he was, in a short time frame, I think he deeply understood every detail of my research and was able to give me really in-depth feedback on how to improve. So I really appreciate your time and feedback as well, Mark. And then there's RLG, which is, I think it's the fate of a senior student to sort of see people come and go in the same lab. But I think it's always been a very welcoming place for me. It's a place where I can really have, deep conversations on various topics. And we always have, walking textbooks on math and engineering, which I really appreciate are resources that were valuable to me throughout my PhD. And, more than everything, I feel, you guys have gone beyond colleagues and really become close friends that mean a lot to me. So really appreciate the time together. And among those, I'd like to sort of call out to my three close collaborators, Peng. So Peng is kind of like a brother in arms, battle brother to me. Where's Peng? Oh, hi. And I think the latest that we stayed at the lab together was around 6 a.m. So we kind of spend all night up trying to finish this project. And I think there are a lot of times in my PhD where I just wanted to quit. Well, sorry, not quit PhD, but more like I wanted to give up on this specific experiment. And I think Peng's just got this incredible grit and perseverance that just kept me going. I don't know if he forced me to go, but I think it was just really inspiring to work with Peng. And over time, I think he's been a really good friend as well. I enjoyed talking about Dark Souls, which is this great game investment, and Donald Trump for some reason. Okay. Um, Max, I think Max really had a eccentric personality, but it quickly grew to be a major supporter of my mental health. So I really appreciate his time as well. And I think I really learned a lot from Max. He was almost like my second advisor on, how to think more scientifically and theoretically. And thanks for teaching me high dimensional statistics and concentration inequalities. I would never have learned them if it were not for you. Lou has a very calm and friendly facade, but if you get close to her, she's kind of hardcore. Uh, I think she's one of the most hardworking people I've ever seen in my life when it comes to the consistency of it. And I think she's been a constant source of both emotional support and great inspiration for me to work harder. So okay, and now I'd like to really thank my collaborators at TRI and BDI. It was, I think I had the incredible fortune of working at Boston, where we had the world's top talent in robotics, and the way that both these companies think about things and the level of engineering that they do, the maturity of it. I think I really learned a lot over time. Finally, I have my family. So my mom and my sister are sitting over there. I actually left home pretty early when I was 15. So I spent half of my life, alone. And I think throughout all those times, a part of me always kind of missed home. And, throughout all those times, it's been very comforting to know that, no matter what happens, I think there are people that really care about me and love me. So, I'd like to really say thank you a lot. And as I'm going back to Korea, I really look forward to, spending more time with my family. And special thanks to Danny, who's Danny in our lab, who's this the goodest dog ever. He's just the joy of my life. And concluding final remarks. So this is actually my picture of my grandfather with her mom, with my mom. I'm sorry, and this is me with my dad. And you can see our as babies, we actually look very similar. Um, But I think I always thought a lot about my grandpa because I look after my mom. My mom takes after my grandpa, and so I always kind of held the feeling of as if I'm my grandpa just born in my generation, right? Unfortunately, I think he sort of passed away this June. So I last saw him in May, which was incredibly fortunate, I think, but. I really like to dedicate my thesis to my grandpa, if this meant any of, significant human development. Okay, and that's it. Thank you so much.
Do we get questions from anybody in the audience here or online, the general open session, and then we'll ask folks to leave except for the closed committee meeting after that. So fire away.
Yes, Cormac, thank you.
All right, awesome presentation, awesome work there. I think sort of the application question for you. You mentioned in one of your Liberian examples, you're thinking you're seeing a bit of a significant angular error.
Yep.
Due to slipping going on.
Yep. Yep.
I'm seeing a lot of interest out there, sort of anti-slip controllers, tactile sensors, force.
Yep.
Do you think there's some roots in putting that alongside your method and eventually help reduce that error?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So I think fundamentally what we're seeing is that we're planning with the quasi-static method, but actually deploying it on a second order system. And just like model-based RL, when there's like a sim to real gap, I think the key is to stay close to, where models kind of match. So I think if I just had a controller that was able to enforce the quasi-staticness in closed loop, that would be the best scenario. And I think we have a lot of interest in that. I wouldn't know how to do it right now, but I think it involves squeezing a bit harder. Yeah. Yes.
Amazing line of work. Yeah. Insightful research and insightful operations on Microsoft. I have a question about extending your smooth dynamics to more object more detailed geometry.
Okay. Yep.
One of the things that abstract kind of allows me to do is almost look at the object orthogonal, but towards objects with more potentially non-complex geometry. That's very detailed. Smooth dynamics can give you potentially the wrong which way the object. And how to
Yeah, so I think there's a question of like, given a context geometry, how do you abstract contact forces? But usually in simulators, I think we do this after like the collision detection layer gives us the normals for the geometries. And so you're true that, we don't really abstract that level. There are ways in which you can smooth this out, I think, and I'll mention maybe three. First one is you can do that in a randomized way too. So if you perturb the objects together, query all the normals and sort of average them, it might give you some average sense of direction. And I think Justin Carpentier, who's in my thesis committee, has some work on that. TRI also has a great hydroelastic model, and I think this is also a way to sort of analytically think about a more smoother version of what it's like to compute contact normals. The third one is maybe if we could maybe take a more parametrized version of an object like superquadrics, for example, that becomes smoother as we tune some variable, then maybe that might be a solution as well. Yeah. Sava?
Here, can you start your comment on how that contact is actually smooth? Apply all the old methods to do it, or it's all robots, or robots with two dynamics to contact. One of it is one approach is pretty popular for us. Drone smooth system is throw all the constraints through the cost function, so one big constraint with the maximization. What do you think would prevent us from you can go work for smooth contact?
Yeah, so if you actually look at Igor Mordacz's method on contact invariant optimization, that's pretty much exactly what it does. And I don't think there's anything that prevents us from doing that. Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's just a question of how do you encode, but then you run into this problem. I mean, at least in our lab, if I understand Russ's perspective correctly, I feel like as we put more of those things as a cost, we have to kind of tune the, weighting variables. So I think we've been kind of saying, let's be absolutely kind of crisp about how we formulate our optimization problems. And most of the times, I think we find that most things are better off as constraints instead of tuning the variables, except for like truly multi-objective cases, I guess. Yeah. Alex and then Preston.
So, online there's a lot of consistencies, so that is fast, but it's not blazingly fast. So how much, I guess, how fast is it? Do you have any time to do something like, if you were saying you had a slip control or compute something on top of that, would you have to run these at a lower rating? Really?
I think,
These are all open loop.
yeah, these are all open loop. I do have closed loop videos, yeah. But I think how fast is it is, let's see. I think it really first depends on the system because, as you get more context. So for the EUI, I think it's literally blazing fast, kind of. We're talking maybe in order to compute like 100 of these, maybe you would need a second. So maybe about 100 hertz. For the Allegro, I think we're down to maybe 10 to 20, but still pretty good. And three, I think there was the second part of your question, which I'm blanking out on.
Do you think for something maybe a bit more than these actually?
I think so, yeah. I think there's definitely a bit of a computation bottleneck, although I'm pretty happy with the rates right now for quasi-static motion. But yeah, I mean, the slip controller, I think there needs to be some difference in time scale. And I wish there was a good theory on this. Peng and I always talks about this a lot, but we haven't really seen, yeah, rigorous works on how to justify this. Preston?
So first, framework was, yeah, super. I think one question I have for you kind of touches on the closing question, which is like a really practical consideration here is sustained estimation cost.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I was curious, I know you said that you're very good, but I was curious how interested you are in the problem, like if you think the, say, like proposed uncertainty plays nicely with your excluding like randomization.
Okay, that's really good. So I think contact is kind of special in a way that not all state space is feasible, right? So, I think that's a pretty fundamental problem we have to solve. And, I think in practice, we kind of have an estimator that, puts things out of penetration. I mean, we don't do it with vision, but when we first have these kind of IR markers, right, that we use mocap from, then I think we have a layer that pulls it out of penetration. But I do think, especially as your geometries get a little bit more non-smooth, small errors could lead to extremely stiff responses in closed loop. And so I do think that's the problem. And I think maybe you speak to a more sort of fundamental limitation of MPC, which is that if I had somehow randomized these offline and learned the policy, I think it might have done better. But, because we're computing things on open loop based on the current state, I don't quite know how to inject robustness very well in the MPC setting. Boyan.
So, so you do this linear rollout from your first order, but from your first order approximation of the steel statics, and you do that to local detector. You roll this out with the possibility. I'm wondering how many stacks can you roll out without getting the possibility extremely small?
Yeah, I think this is a good question. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention one surprising thing in the thesis, which is the Allegro hand demo, which you saw, used just one horizon, which is pretty surprising. But in practice, I think maybe 6 or 7 is where we expect things to be a little bit more. And I think that's very consistent with like model-based RL works I've done in the past. That's where things get a little bit more. I mean, both time consuming and, I think I need a lot more. It's easier to fall into local minima and all these things. So yeah, I think in practice, we cap it around like 5, 6, things like this. Yeah.
Okay, maybe we'll transition to the next phase.
Yeah.
Thank you.